In all of my working experience, I started in this change space 25 years ago. It became evident early on that there is a predictable pattern that happens when we go through change. It's funny, companies would call and say, we're going through this change and here's why we're unique. And it felt unique to them because they were experiencing it. But what I realized through research, through client work, is everybody's going through this same 4-step journey.
Here's a pre-show scenario for you. Imagine you had to visit 16 houses just to cook your dinner. One place has the pots and pans, one has the stove, another has the food. You get the idea. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, the reality is most global businesses operate the same way, using 16 different tools to hire, pay, manage, and develop their workforce. But now there's one platform that does it all. Deel. That's DEEL. Deel is your forever people platform built for global payroll and HR. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, Deel works for your entire team. So are you ready to transform your global payroll and HR processes? If you are, click the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deel today. That's DEEL. Hello and welcome back to the HR L&D podcast. I'm your host. I'm Nick Day. I'm CEO of JGA Recruitment Group. We're specialist HR recruiters with offices now in the UK, Europe, and the US as well. And today we're going to be exploring one of the most important topics for leaders today. What is that, I hear you say? It's navigating change, navigating culture, and of course, talking about that keyword that sits amongst it all, communication. And these 3 C's are vital to leading successful teams and organizations in this rapidly changing world. So to help me unpack some of that and some of those concepts, I've got Curtis Bateman with me today, a leadership expert from FranklinCovey. Curtis has worked with leaders and organizations around the globe to help them not only manage change, but really thrive through it. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss the process of change, how to manage team transitions, the critical role of culture and communication in navigating those challenges, and also how you can strengthen your leadership skills as well, because we know that organizations really succeed through change, and we need strong leadership to make sure that change can happen and that change can be embedded as well. So without further ado, welcome Curtis Bateman to the HR L&D podcast. How are you feeling today?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really happy to be here and have the conversation.
Yeah, I'm super excited. As you know, and for the listeners that have been with me for a long time listening, we've had many members from FranklinCovey's wonderful work on the show before. I'm a huge advocate for the work that you do. So super stoked to have you here. But I'm interested to see what you have to say to my first question, something I ask all of my guests, which is this: what do the words human resources mean to you?
If you asked all your guests, or you have asked them, that sounds like you're probably going to have a lot of answers.
I do.
It's a good question. Obviously, there's all the business definitions in terms of the function, the role, everything that goes on in there. But for me, the first word in this is what matters so much: human, right? The work we do is with people, helping them grow, helping them in their career, taking care of them, thinking about the employee experience. And it's, for me, it's a pretty particular stewardship, I feel, as a leader when I think about the humans that are involved in all of this. So, of course, there's all these, these definitions and functions and features and services that we provide. But for me, it all orbits around our people. And I love them. I love the opportunity to work with people, to coach, to help them grow. And organizations, hopefully, are lining up the resources to care for and provide the services and resources that take care of those people. And you'll see as we get into the conversation, that forms a lot of the basis for the work that I've been doing on change, is this idea of people. So I think we'll be able to see some of that woven into the fabric of our conversation today as well.
Super. Well, it's a great place to start. And I think people like to hear that word people because, we're moving into an interesting era of change, which obviously is going to encompass artificial intelligence, a lot of unknowns and these things. And actually, amongst it all, that ability to understand nuance and to contextualize and to humanize, people, as we become more isolated with these sort of globally distributed workforces now and AI taking over mundane tasks, actually, I think we seek that human communication more than we've ever done before. But you're the expert here. I'm going to ask you some of your opinions on that. Before we do, you mentioned the word change at the end of that. So let's start there, because I think the first of those 3 C's I mentioned in the introduction was change. You've helped many leaders navigate change. So walk us through the process of change and from your perspective, what really contributes to successfully getting through it.
Oh, that's a big question. Let me walk you through the process first, and then we can add on to it. So, in all of my working experience, I started in this change space, 25 years ago. It became evident early on that there is a predictable pattern that happens when we go through change. It's funny, companies would call and say, we're going through this change, and here's why we're unique. And it felt unique to them because they were experiencing it. But what I realized through research, through client work, is everybody's going through this same kind of 4-step journey. And so in the change model that we use as a framework when we talk to people, leaders, organizations about change, we start in the zone of status quo, which is before a change. Before a change for individuals. Obviously, leaders are always thinking about changes. But before a change, the zone of status quo, as individuals, we're pretty happy. As people, as humans, we like predictable, we like non-threatening, we like routine. And so the zone of status quo is that stage where we know what we're doing, we show up to work, we feel really comfortable, life is good. And then the unimaginable happens. Either through leaders or external forces, a change gets introduced. And when a change is introduced, what we find is there's an instant impact on results. And so just think about results going down. Maybe it's a revenue result. Maybe it's a client satisfaction result. Perhaps it is an employee engagement result or a turnover result or a profitability result. Whatever it is, somewhere in a change when we introduce it, something starts to have an adverse impact from it. And that zone of disruption is a space where our people are looking to really get clear on, oh my goodness, what does this mean to me? And we can leave people floundering in that space if we're not careful. But as we work with them through that space, what's changing? Why is it changing? What does it mean to you and our team? We start to enable people to say, oh, I get it, and I want to be part of this, or I don't want to be part of this. But they make a decision. And when they decide that the bottom of the results impact, then they say, let's start working on it, which is the zone of adoption. And the zone of adoption is a messy space. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Things don't always work. We're trying new things. And so we'd love it to be this quick reclaim, the ground we had, but it's more of a messy space. But we work through it. We learn, we grow, we develop new ways of working, new ideas. We innovate. Maybe we use technology, you referenced AI, to figure out new and better ways to accomplish what we're being asked to do. Hopefully that moves us back through this zone of adoption to a point where we get back to the level of result where we started, and we start to move into this new and exciting space called the zone of innovation. This is where the change actually starts to pay back all of the effort we've put into it. So if you think about the middle 2 zones, we're really incurring the cost of change. And the zone of innovation towards the top starts to pay us back, and hopefully it allows us to take the great ideas and the great learnings we've had and extend and get more value out of them. And this predictable pattern, Nick, happens in every change. I have a lot of leaders that call me and say, I want to go from the status quo to innovation, and I giggle to myself. It just never happens. And so this predictable pattern plays out over and over again. Personal change, professional change, organizational change. And as we look at it, and as we start to study it and learn about it, we realize in each of those zones there are things we can be doing. There are things that we can be thinking. And as we understand that and take action, it allows us to move through this process faster. So we shrink how long it takes. We can start to shrink how much impact it creates for the negative and increase the impact it has for the positive. So it's a great thing. It's a predictable pattern. See it over and over again. And, then the other part of your question, how do you have some success with it and get value out of it and move through it? My short answer, which I'm sure we can dig into, is mindset, skill set, and tool set for each of those zones. And if we can work on that with individuals and leaders, then we can influence our effectiveness in each of those 4 zones.
I'm glad you mentioned that at the end, because I was just thinking as I was listening to your response there that if it's so predictable, then why do we have such different levels of outcome in terms of either a successful change program or not successful? But I think you've highlighted where, because it is predictable, if it is not working, my assumption would be it's because of one of those 3 things you raised at the end, that mindset, that, the tool set or whatever, or something else. Skill set. So you're able to then understand, actually, it is predictable, Nick. It's not successful because somewhere in one of these areas, it's not quite working. So what are some of the big obstacles that leaders do face when they are moving their teams through change? Guide me through some of those elements.
Yeah. If you think about change being I hate to use this, but it's a good analogy. Like let's say we're on the ocean and change represents a storm that comes. One of the first obstacles that we encounter in the zone of disruption is we've put everybody into a state of disruption, turbulence. So if you think about a storm in the ocean and we've got 10 people on a team, based on skill set, mindset, and tool set, somebody might be in the equivalent of a canoe and somebody might be in a super yacht based on their mindset, skill set, and tool set, their experience. And so it's the same storm for everybody, but they'll experience it very differently based on the quality of vessel that they're in. And so people and the uniqueness of their circumstance is one of the first and biggest challenges we encounter. A second big challenge we encounter is leaders have been in the back room, in the boardroom, working on a change. They've been looking at market factors, data, and they realize, oh my, we need to make an adjustment here. We need to innovate, or we need to shift this, or add this to it, or pull this apart. And they'll spend days, weeks, months, or years looking at all of the inputs that tell them they need to make the change. But they come out on stage and they go, ta-da, we've got a change to announce. And they then wonder, well, why isn't everybody excited? But they miss the fact that all of the emotional, intellectual, and capability journey that they've been working on, they haven't given that to any of their people. They've just done a big reveal. And so the journey of helping people understand what's changing and why hasn't happened. And if we just do this one big announcement with enthusiasm, balloons, and fanfare, it still doesn't give them that. So we need leaders to not only announce the change, but then to engage. One of your themes is around communication. Well, we need to move from monologue to dialogue. We need to have leaders engage and help clarify. So the second thing is, this leadership approach, the vision and the communication around it is often quite lacking. So we put our people into this state of disruption. We have leaders that aren't actually using really solid change skills. And so it creates this perfect collision of where people are from their experience. Change is really hard. I don't like it. It usually ends up lousy for me. And leaders not doing the work to help bring their people along. And when those collide, it creates all these problems. And that's why everybody has this experience bias of change is really hard and it usually doesn't go very well. So you instantly get into this experience bias problem from both sides. And we need to bridge that gap.
I can understand it. I mean, if we use that boat analogy, I think often when people are working through change projects, particularly in the HR space, it's been delivered to them that they need to create this change from above, from C-suite. So that's like someone saying, you've got to take this boat from the UK and you've got to sell it to the US. That's the outcome. We need to be in the US. And there's a lack of appreciation sometimes about how tough that voyage might be. They need the outcome. They haven't necessarily considered the things that need the storms they're going to have to get through in order to get to that point. So there can be a level of frustration there because that communication piece is kind of delivered down without necessarily the empathy or the understanding of what needs to happen to make that through. And I wonder how much of that then is how much culture plays a part in that part of the process. Because equally, when you talked about the person on the boat, the canoe, or the super yacht, and I think your example you gave, I think even if you're all in the same vessel, there's still a mindset shift. There'll be those that say we can get through this, and there'll be those that want to jump off and go, we're doomed. So, and I think some of that plays into the culture place as well, right? So I'm interested to know how you manage those expectations upwards, but at the same time manage those cultural or whatever, culture is the right word, but those personality traits, that belief systems at the frontline level as well. Because I think HR have got a difficult role to play. It's almost always a balancing act from managing upwards and managing, in the same sphere as well.
Yeah, what's funny is if they're crossing the ocean, right now, a lot of leaders, I guess not right now, but usually what I see broadly is a lot of leaders push the more button, row harder, work longer. And that does play into that point of friction that HR finds themselves in, trying to think about the people, their well-being, their employee engagement, and also make sure that we're delivering on what the business needs, which is the change. So how does culture play into that? If we have a culture where there's high trust, you are going to start with people feeling more at ease, more like there's a dialogue, more like, okay, they've thought through these things. If we have a command and control culture where we tell and people do, then we create probably the most extreme polarized scenario here. I've told you to do it, go do it, work harder. I'm telling you, work longer, figure it out. And what that does is it shuts people down and says, well, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do, which is the exact opposite of what we need in change. Usually we're trying to find new and better ways to get better outcomes. And my perspective on this with people is, let's figure out how to activate their creativity and their engagement. If we can do that, then they'll bring their heart and their mind, their back and their hands to the problems. And we'll get more creativity, we'll get more energy, we'll get better outcomes and better ideas. And so culture plays a huge part. The leadership culture, the organizational culture, the culture around how we think about and treat our people and work with our people. And so you're right to highlight that. It is a big factor. And who creates culture? Leadership, right? They lead on this. And so if you find that it's perpetually difficult over and over again, I think that's a good question to pause and ask yourself, what is it we're doing in the culture from a leadership perspective that creates this lower trust, high friction, high resistance, tell me what to do mindset? That will increase the cost of that dip in the change process significantly, which means every time there is a need for a change, you run into the data that I've collected over the years. 88% of employees believe that a new change is going to lead to something worse for themselves.
That's an interesting stat. 88%.
Yeah,
wow.
It's alarming. And 72% think it'll lead to something worse for the organization. So their experience bias in your organization says, gosh, this isn't going to be good.
So are there questions that leaders can ask themselves to try and understand? I mean, we have an innate sense of what culture we might be working in. I understand that. But obviously that's often limited to our self-awareness and self-perspective. Are there specific questions we could ask to actually understand or to even reveal what a true culture might be within an organization? I think it's important as well, because HR may want to make that, when they realize what their true nature is, they may want to do some work to change it potentially.
Yeah. So I'll give a very FranklinCovey lensed approach here to this. One of our areas of focus is this idea of building high trust cultures.
Yeah.
We believe that when you have a high trust culture, the speed of the work you do increases and the cost decreases. So for us, we would use a tool like a team trust index, where we actually do a culture assessment, a trust assessment. And what we find, this is so funny, probably not funny to me, funny to us. Leaders usually say our trust levels are here, and employees usually rate it here. And there's always this gap, this delta. I suppose that's not funny, ha, but it's interesting because it's pretty consistent. And what it highlights is this gap between how leaders and employees perceive their culture. But think about it. If you can face that, if you can talk about it, if you can look at it, look at the questions that go on in a thing like a team trust index, it helps you understand as leaders where you can behave and lead differently. And again, the more you can do to increase trust, then the more you'll do to increase the speed with which the organization works and the speed with which you can implement change, and you'll decrease the cost of change. And that allows you to address things like trust taxes. Do we have reluctant compliance? Do we have disengagement? Do we have high turnover, right? Those are all trust taxes. And you can start to work on trust dividends where you've got higher retention, higher customer retention, higher engagement, higher well-being, higher collaboration. And all of those things show up as forms of evidence inside your culture around the level of trust you've got.
Sure. I mean, trust is such a powerful component to any successful organization. Certainly for listeners that are interested in finding out more about this, we've had Stephen M. R. Covey on the show twice talking about the speed of trust, Trust and Inspire, brilliant books, brilliant podcasts, by the way. So do go check out the previous episodes. And, he really builds on that premise in much more detail. But I think, one aspect of trust we talk about then is often find the right way to communicate with our staff. Communication is so integral to creating trust within our organization. So I know that one of the biggest leadership challenges, certainly with HR professionals, is find that right balance between courage and consideration in communication. So I wonder if there's some examples you can give or a way that we can help HR to navigate what a balanced conversation can look like when you're trying to balance these things together.
Yeah, I love that you've mentioned the courage and consideration. In our experience, those are the two variables that are really at play here. And I think one of the things that we fall prey to, this trap, is that we want to be nice. And because we're nice, we tend to lean towards a high consideration style of communication, especially if we find ourselves in HR, right? We're in the people business.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that being nice is actually good. I think we need to think about being kind. And kind means, let me communicate the things that will help you do your very best work. And sometimes that includes feedback that says, we need to get better in this way. And so that really suggests, hey, let's get the right balance between courage and consideration here. Courage to tackle the issues that will help Curtis, me, be a better person. I really want that from my boss. I want to succeed. And so learning to get the right equilibrium there and not have that skewed towards consideration because we think we're being nice really improves the nature of our communication. It helps us be better communicators. It helps us lead to better outcomes, right? Organizations aren't clubs. They're not families. They're organizations. And to be in the organization, your level of contribution matters. And so when we think about courage and consideration, we need to have the right balance there to make sure that we're helping people be successful.
Well, hopefully that's resonating with the audience. I know that many HR professionals are going to be, and we're in kind of the realm of the third C now of communication. We know that one of the biggest challenges they have is being able to engage positively in those difficult conversations. They're the things that the HR professionals, don't look forward to in their day. We often put them back towards the end of the day. I'd always say, try and get them done first. But I know that there's a lot of work that FranklinCovey have promoted about defining purpose and being really clear about your positive intent when you're engaging with these difficult conversations, especially when you're trying to navigate change. I wonder if you could just bring that to life a little bit for our audience.
Yeah. Let me come back to I think there's two angles we need to pursue in the question you're asking. Let's come back specifically to the change.
Sure.
Especially in the zone of disruption. If we think about each person being in their own different, unique kind of boat in the storm, this leads us to an important communication point. Sometimes we like to have a peanut butter spread. Let's have one communication over the top of everything. But if we come right down to the individual frontline employee and realize you're in a boat, you're in a power boat, you're in a yacht, what they need in the communication will be unique to them. And so I think it's okay to have corporate messages and team messages, but if we really want to help our people in a change move through the zone of disruption, we need to get to the individualized communication. And that's the beauty of a frontline leader. You've got 6 to 10 employees. You have the capacity to meet with and talk with those people to help them work through, okay, what's changing and why is it changing? So do we get the why? And what does that mean for our team? What is our team doing? What are we moving from and to? Old work behaviors, new work behaviors, old outcomes expected of us, new outcomes expected of us. These skills to these skills. And if we can work on that at an individual level and we can help them get clear on that, then we put them in a position to understand how they can lean into the change. So it's very targeted, very specific communication skills for people that are in the zone of disruption. Some of those might be difficult. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I want to bring all this together then, because there's a lot going on here, a lot of awareness-based sort of things for people to consider when we're talking about how we're approaching staff as well. I think some of this needs to come into self-awareness, because we're talking about a little bit here about how we need to be aware of the culture of organization, aware of the change, aware how it impacts other people, be aware of the kind of culture we're even based within. We need to also be aware of the objectives of our senior C-suite as well, and make sure we're considering those at the same time. So where does self-awareness and emotional intelligence come into this in terms of effective leadership? We hear empathy is often the quality that's highlighted more than any other when it comes to effective leadership. And we know that leaders often want to cultivate empathy, and they want to be seen to have this emotional intelligence. They want to also lead through change and these culture shifts. So how do we cultivate that? How do we make sure we're able to remain empathetic whilst having some of these often difficult change-orientated conversations? Hello, HR and people leaders. Are you exhausted of the war for talent cliche? The problem is, when we hear a cliche, it usually exists for a reason. However, we think it's time for a fresh approach to the talent crisis. That's because at JGA Recruitment, we understand the real challenges you face in sourcing phenomenal HR and people candidates. And guess what? We think we have the solution. Our team is on a mission to revolutionize your hiring process. That's because we're not just recruiters. We're strategic partners dedicated to finding HR and people professionals who align perfectly with your company's vision and goals. So let's break the cycle of frustration together. Partner your talent acquisition strategies with JGA Recruitment and experience the difference in service, excellence, and results. No longer do you need to suffer the costs associated with a poor hire, because with over 100 5-star Google reviews and already trusted by many of the world's leading brands, why don't you take action today? Contact us at jgarecruitment.com to discover how we can help transform your HR and people teams. And here's a bonus. When you visit us, you can sign up for our weekly HR newsletter that's packed with invaluable industry insights and more. Let's revolutionize your HR talent acquisition strategies together and make the war for talent a cry from the past. Visit jjrecruitment.com to find out more.
Yeah. Well, let's consider the starting point. We live in a world where we really celebrate individual contributors, and they often become first-level leaders. Think about it. If I was a software developer or a great finance person, or if I was a brilliant salesperson, I'm often promoted to lead. That doesn't mean I ever had aspirations to lead. That doesn't mean I ever thought of leading. It means because I was a good individual contributor, I've been given an opportunity. But that means they probably haven't entered into that role with any real preparation or thought around what does being a great leader look like. They know good leaders they've had and bad leaders they've had. And so developing this leadership capability of empathy, understanding, communicating, feedback, organizations really need to think about developing that. And I know organizations focus on it, but new leaders often, it can be 6 years before they get any leadership development, and they've been in a leadership role, right? The statistics are alarming on that. And so if we say, hey, you're a leader, and a year later there's a change, and they've never had any development around these skills or capabilities, it's an impairment, right? They're handicapped to try and lead that. So with change, or even outside of change, these are capabilities that first level leaders should need to be developing and should be developing. And part of the reason I love the change space and I got into it was to try and help these first level leaders. This is where change fails. It's where it really breaks at the first level leader, because they don't have the experience, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the training they need, and they make all the difference because they're the most trusted relationship in the organization. And so I've built in the tools really, really simple that says, okay, just say this and it will help you. For example, I've got a tool called Hurdles, Quicksand, and Brick Walls in our change content. And the question says, list all of the issues or challenges we're facing as a team. Get them on a whiteboard or a piece of paper. Okay, now give the definition that says hurdle. Gosh, it's there, but we can jump over it. I can jump over it. The team can jump over it. Quicksand. We're going to get stuck on this issue, but if I have somebody with me to pull me out, we can make it through. Brick wall. We're going to slam into that. So then we say all of the issues that you've listed as a team, leader, just ask your team now to start putting them into these 3 buckets. All right. Wow, there's 50% of them are in this first bucket. Amazing. We can go work on that. And it starts to help everybody realize, oh, there's some things we can do. We can be busy. We can be active. We can be engaged. Fabulous. That starts to help them feel in control, like they have influence, like they have engagement. And suddenly they feel really good. And the leader feels like I've helped them there. Then quicksand, right? Which ones are here? All right, there's about 30% that are here. If we work on this and you go talk to this other team and ask for this, we can figure out how to get through that. And the 20%, leader, that's your job to go take those away and figure that out. So we've tried to simplify it and say you may or may not have those skills, but if you'll follow the simplicity of some of these tools, we've built the emotional intelligence into it. We've built the good questioning into it to help you get through it, whether or not you have those skills. And that way, it sets you up to help your team and yourself move through it. And if you do that 4 or 5 times, you will actually start to develop some of those other emotional intelligence or culture skills because you've used some tools that have been carefully crafted to activate that along the way.
I'd say there's something that resonates in what you've just said. And you mentioned at the start of your response that actually, you're absolutely right. A lot of people put into first level leadership roles because they've done really well in their job. And they think, hey, with the next level of promotion, then we're going to put you in charge of a team. And of course, often they didn't ask for that, but they don't want to turn down a promotion either. It usually comes with a raise and different things. So we move into those roles. And often actually organizations do invest in those stuff, but they tend to invest in the hard skills. Right? To have this, you need to have the technical understanding to do X, Y, and Z. You need to know the compliance requirements for whatever. And they neglect the softer skills. And what I liked about your tool response there is that it seems to be that in the example you gave, it draws out people's aptitudes. It draws out the softer skills in people, the ability to problem solve, the ability to think laterally to, if you need a tenacious response or you need a patient response. And in a team-based scenario, you get the best of all of those different worlds working together. And it leads me to ask a question because it's a word, and I wasn't going to ask this, but your response has lent me to it. One of the most common words we hear in the world of HR and change is the word resilience. And you need to develop your skills in adaptability and resilience. And I wonder if we get the toolbox right in the first instance, in the way that you've just described, if we're able to pull out people's real aptitude for problem solving and whatever it might be, how important is resilience in that mode? Because I would argue that potentially if you've got the strength of your softer skills really showing and coming to the fore, actually you probably don't need it quite as much, but you might go, actually, Nick, no, resilience is always critical. I'm just keen to get your thoughts.
I love this question. It's really important because I think organizations rely on people being resilient. And I think they burn out because it's very rare that we're just addressing one change at a time. Usually there's 2 or 3 things in motion. I read an interesting article. It was either in Fast Company or Harvard Business Review, maybe 4 years ago. And it was all about resilience. And the research on the resilience in that article said, resilience is like a muscle. It fatigues. And so if you're just relying on resilience, then what happens in the change process is you come from the zone of status quo, you come into the zone of disruption, and then you get into the zone of adoption. And if we're not careful, when we get into the zone of adoption, the resilience starts to fatigue. And we see this in the data. IBM has some data, and so does Harvard, that says 85% of change initiatives fail to reach their intended outcome. And in my view, they make it through the first 3 zones, and they kind of just claw their way back to where they were, and they don't really have the energy or the well or leftover reserve to get into the zone of innovation, where all the benefit comes from the change. And so if we just rely on resilience to carry the day, we end up having pretty lackluster outcomes from the change. And we also start to burn our people out, which I think has some other consequences, right? It may impact engagement. It may impact attrition and retention. It may impact creative excitement in the work we do. So it's certainly a factor. No change is perfect. We need resilient people. But we can do better than that.
Yeah.
We can do better than that by giving them tools and skills and capability. So when we do need to harness resilience, it's a reserve that gets us through the last whatever.
Yeah, because I would consider resilience in the way that you've just articulated it as well as kind of that last bastion of defense. Because if you've got choices, if you go back to that boat analogy, if there's a lifeboat and there's oars and there's a sail, while we've got opportunities and choices, we don't often need to fall back on our resilience. We feel hopeful. It's when those choices have been exhausted, we suddenly need to fall back on that level of resilience. But I would argue then you're there because you probably haven't exhausted that toolkit you mentioned earlier. You haven't highlighted what are hurdles, what's quicksand, and what are brick walls, and you haven't sort of harbored those things together. So I just thought it was a really interesting concept, because I think we often talk too much about resilience, and I would argue that it's not that it's not important, but it should be your last line of defense. Exhaust other things first.
It's also a little careless, Nick. It's also a little careless because organizations are saying the burden's on you to be resilient. And the organization needs to take ownership and play their part, play the part of good leadership, play the part of skill development, play the part of resources needed for change to be successfully accomplished. And then with all of that in play, it's okay to draw on the resilience, but don't just expect that to be your go-to tool.
Sure. Yeah. If you're relying on resilience straight off the bat to get you through something, then that's when you're going to encompass words that you mentioned, things like burnout more quickly, right? And it makes total sense to me. So I want to talk a little bit about your book and some of the work that you do as well. I think our audience will be really keen to hear about some of the insights you've developed, and obviously it's a best-selling book. It's called Change: How to Turn Uncertainty into Opportunity. Before we do, I'm always keen to find out when I'm speaking to real industry leaders in this space, what you think is going to be coming up in the future. So are there any kind of emerging trends or challenges related to change, culture, or communication that perhaps our leaders should be prepared for?
Yeah. Yep. So the answer is, of course, yes. It's funny, when I lead workshops, every once in a while I'll say, how many of you expect less change next year than you had this year? Everybody, ha, ha, ha. But the reality is, I think change is ever present with us. So what drives that? Of course, technology is a big driver. We're going to see AI continue to drive transformation, challenge, difficulty, opportunity into everything we do. That's cool. It helps us develop new and better ways of working, but it will drive a significant amount of change. I think this last year there have been, 75 countries that have had elections where they've voted on leaders in their country. Those kind of things obviously create a lot of change. They'll create change around legislation, regulation. And so it would be, I can't imagine where there wouldn't be change. And I think we still have change around whatever this new normal is for work.
Yeah.
Organizations are struggling. People need connection, but we've got completely work at home, completely remote, organizations forcing people back. And there's a reason for it. People need connection, and yet they love the flexibility that not being in an office creates. There's some new equilibrium there still to be figured out. So yeah, I'd say there's a lot of change on the horizon. And 2 years from now, it will be new and exciting changes and challenging changes, which for me is really cool. I picture a world where if we could help people be 20% better at change, what would that do to their lives? Or if they were 40% better, what would that mean for you and me and leaders and organizations? I think that's got a lot of value. So I'm really driven and find purpose in what we do to help people move to that kind of new state of capability.
Well, I can see why you would be excited. I mean, we were talking about zones earlier, but your zone of genius is clearly change. I mentioned you've written a fantastic best-selling book, which you co-authored. I mentioned the book is called Change, How to Turn Uncertainty into Opportunity. There will be a link in the show notes for those that want to find themselves a copy and find out more. But it's not just the book, of course. You've also been, you pioneered a number of industry-leading solutions that are related to change programs, change element, leaders at change, managing millennials at work, the change practitioner. The list does go on. And again, for those that are really finding this conversation insightful and you want to find out more, there will be links in the show notes to discover more about those. But I'd love to know a little bit more about your journey, Curtis. Tell us a little more about the book, about your change programs, and just your perspective on change, because I've led the questions so far, but I'm sure there's some insights you'd love to share with our listeners.
Yeah. I started my change journey. I started in technology of all things, and I got into the people development part of it with technology. And then just sheer dumb luck. Some people say, how did you manage that in your career? Sheer dumb luck. I stumbled into a circumstance with Dr. Spencer Johnson, the guy that wrote the Who Moved My Cheese book. And it was like a gift to my career. And I started to really pair what I had been learning and what I was learning from him as we worked together, and realized what a big need there was and what a big opportunity there was. And so, you're asking, well, how did you do this? What have you learned? The first thing I learned is his book talked about just this very bottom part of the change curve that says, as a person, you've got a decision to make. And I realized that organizations and leaders needed more than that. What he offered was brilliant, but there was more to it. And so it caused us to get really curious and explore what was going on with change. And I think one of the fun things for me is, yes, we researched it. Yes, we did surveys and studies, and we did secondary and primary research. But we also got out in the field and we tested every idea we had with real life situations. And it was fun to learn and see what really makes a difference. That's what pointed me and my colleagues at the time in the direction of change is a people business. Yes, there's lots of process and lots of project management in change. And if you go back in time, that's what most change management was. Bring in consultants. They'll tell you all of the things you should do. And our point of view over time became, you hire all of these talented people. They know your business. And yet we bring people in to tell them what to do to make a change happen. So our approach was, well, what if we could give people a change in their mindset, an increase in their skill set and tool set, and then unleash them on the change? They know your business, your industry, your customers. Would that lead to a different way of going through change? And it does, because it engages the hearts and minds of your people and allows them to not have the change being done to them, but to shift and to be actors in the change rather than to be acted upon. And for me, that's been a life-changing, career-changing paradigm shift. And it's great because it means I get to work with people, and I find so much personal value in helping people develop and become a better version of themselves. And this change methodology we've created does that. And so the framework gives us the ability to say, okay, here's what's really happening. And it's easy. You can draw this on a napkin. You can talk to your teenagers about it. They'll tell you all about their view of it. You can talk to friends because it's so easy to understand. And then it's easy to just take some steps and get some really significant value out of it. So, that's my journey with Dr. Johnson for a period of about 10 years. And in that time, starting to develop my own methodology. And then to have the moment in time where FranklinCovey acquired our business and said, let's use your change content on a much larger scale. So out of this little boutique training company doing really fun work to now giving it scale. And it's fabulous to see these ideas in use. I was just in a conference in Asia, and I had all these people talking about how they're using our change content. Little moment of pride where I'm thinking, yes, it's making a difference everywhere in the world. And that's really rewarding because the principles are true everywhere. The culture, the leadership style, those adjust based on Asia or Africa or Europe or North America. Great. But the principles and the methodologies hold true in all of those places, and they make a difference. So really fun journey. And I feel like we're just getting started because change isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So New leaders, new changes, new opportunities.
Well, I say change is the only constant, and I think your passion for the subject certainly shines through. Your knowledge on the subject certainly shines through. And the thing that I wanted just to highlight that resonated when you were talking about, whether you bring somebody in or whether you do it in-house. I do know that, I'm talking as a recruiter here, so I'm a specialist of finding people. If you need to go external, right, we can do that. But the reality is if you're able to keep it in-house, number one, it shows that trust that you talked about earlier, that you trust your team to deliver. And it's incredibly empowering. I know that you come from a coaching mindset as well. And coaching, when you ask people how they would do something rather than tell them with that command and control attitude, it's amazing to see the results that can happen. And if we don't give them the opportunity, we'll never know. And I think that you've articulated that brilliantly throughout today's show. I'm so delighted we've had a chance to connect. I think you've given our audience so many fantastic insights into change. And I'm sure for those that want to find out more, they will click on those links in our show notes to find out more about your service as well, Curtis. But what I'd love to do is open the HR L&D vault. I've done this with some of your colleagues and friends, so let's see how this goes with you. 3 short, sharp questions. The first is this. They're quite big. If you could give one piece of advice to a leader dealing with change, culture, or communication challenges right now, you can see I've changed that ever so slightly. What would it be?
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to be vulnerable, meaning one of the reasons leaders choose not to communicate is they're worried they don't have answers. And it's not your job to have all the answers. Be vulnerable. Say, here are the things I don't know, but we'll figure them out. That captures hearts and minds faster than anything else. Just own it and then go figure it out and then return and report when you do have answers. But be vulnerable and work on the unknowns because that's a big part of what's going on in change.
Yeah, fantastic. If you could change one thing about the way organizations approach leadership, what would it be?
Well, I think we're in the middle of a transformation from command and control to what Stephen would have talked about as trust and inspire, which is where we really want to engage our people and to coach them. I'm such a big believer in people. So I would say trusting our people and coaching them to play a significant part rather than think we have to tell them everything.
Okay. And last but by no means least, I think I gave you a bit of an inside track on what the most common response is here. But what's the most common trait that you think you see in the most effective leaders that you've worked with?
Oh, I've got way too many answers for that. But I'll give you one in the context of change.
Super.
I think communicating your vision when you're leading the front end of a change is a leadership capability. That's a storytelling skill. So whether or not you want to call that vision or visioning or storytelling, I think that ability when you're leading change is something that's a difference maker. And not everybody has to tell stories the same way. Some people tell it through data. Some people tell it through experience. Some people tell it through metaphors. But perfecting the art of storytelling when you're announcing and leading change is a leadership capability that is a difference maker.
Yeah, and you know what? I absolutely love that. There was someone once said to me, and I do a lot of talks and speeches and things like that on different subjects about talent retention or whatever it might be. They said, Nick, very rarely will everyone remember anything you've said on stage. They'll come away remembering the feeling. And if you tell stories and you show vulnerability and all the things you've mentioned, and you can tap into the emotion, they'll remember the feeling of what they're trying to say. And then everything else kind of fits in. Like they'll remember bits of it. It'll all connect the dots, but you need to leave them with a feeling of what it is you're trying to convey. And I'm not necessarily saying that's what you were positioning in what you just mentioned, but for me, that aligned with what you've said. It connects to me to vulnerability. It connects me to storytelling. It connects me to all the things, the communication piece that you've discussed in today's episode. And I can only thank you so much for sharing the wisdom you have on change, culture, communication, the future. Your insights, I know, will be valuable to all of the leaders that listen to this show that are facing some of those challenges. And certainly for those that want to find out more, please do once again click on the show notes to find the links to Franklin Covey's official website, but also to Curtis Bateman as well. Curtis, thank you so much for joining me on the HR L&D podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. And of course, for anyone who's listening to this, if you do need support with a payroll or HR related vacancy, that's where my team can help at jgarecruitment.com. We are global, so we can support you with requirements all, anywhere it might be, across any level and across any vertical as well. So my link will also be in the show notes. It just leaves me to say one huge final thank you to Curtis Bateman from Franklin Covey today for joining me on the HR L&D podcast. I've been your host, Nick Day, and I'll bring you the next episode real soon. Curtis, thank you. This episode is sponsored by Deal. That's DEEL. Deal is your forever people platform built for global payroll and HR. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, Deal works for your team. Hire and onboard talent in over 150 countries in minutes and run payroll in over 100 countries in just a few clicks. And with Deal's suite of AI-powered learning and development tools, you can even customize career roadmaps, performance assessments, and more. So are you ready to transform your global payroll and HR processes? If you are, click the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deal today. That's DEEL.